Great, thank you. My name is Karen Scott, and I am the Minute at DOT project manager. I joined the project in December. I started transitioning on while Dave Johnson, the project manager at the time, was transitioning out to retire. So I've been with the project for a few months, getting familiar with it still. There is a lot to learn, but it's pretty interesting. A lot of good people working on this project. I've been with MnDOT for about 12 years, and all that time as a project manager. Prior to this AASHTOWare project, I worked on the TAMS, the Transportation Asset Management System implementation, for about 4 or 5 years. So I've been around for a while. And with me presenting is Suzanne Salette, who's the business analyst for the project, and I will let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Suzanne. I am the business analyst for the AASHTOWare Materials P1230 project. I have been with MnDOT for just over 6 years, and the first projects I was assigned to was the materials implementation and the construction implementation of AASHTOWare. Prior to that, I actually worked for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension doing business analysis on their projects there. So.
All right. I'm going to share my screen, and I am going to actually lead off with the timeline that Gina showed in the last segment, which was, this was a timeline that was implemented along with that change order number 3 that she talked about. And what this timeline shows is implementation of the materials labs in 6-month increments, really 4 or 5 months for development, and then a month of post-implementation support. So originally the CO cement and chem analytical labs, which were being worked on when I joined the project, were going to move to production in January 2020. They actually ended up moving to production in April of 2020. We are currently working on the CO aggregate and bituminous labs right now, which according to this timeline should move to production in July. But will not. So this current timeline is actually in transition, and we are working on creating, I think, a more realistic timeline based on the experience that we've gained with this software and with the project process and with materials in general since we started working on this really back in 2017. So I'm going to switch slides, and this is the current revised timeline. This particular timeline covers just the lab implementation. And as you can see in here, so phase 1, which is the first half of the chem analytical and cement labs, was implemented in July of 2019. We moved on to phase 2, which we just moved to production in April, which was the second half of the chem analytical lab and the cement labs. And now we are currently in what we're calling phase 3. We're working on aggregate and bituminous labs. And based on our past experience and how long it's taken us to implement the other phases, how much work is involved, how complex that work is, etc., we're estimating at this point that we will move this phase into production most likely in the beginning of March 2022. So I'm going to move on to, I'm going to shut this down. Oops, I need to hit escape. Shut this down, and I'm going to move on to another document. And I think I have to reshare. Bear with me for just a minute. Okay, so what this document shows, I want to talk a little bit about the work that's been involved in the project, the implementation of the materials module thus far, and what we have left to do. So this the first phase of implementing materials involved, started in November of 2017, went to production in July of 2019. Took about 20 months, and we moved into production 22 agency views. They're listed here. We moved 8 reports. Agency views are the user interface that people use to enter information about the tests they perform and those test results. And then the reports, of course, are the result of the information that gets reported out to counties, to cities, to the project folder, that kind of thing about the tests that were run. This first implementation involved a week of training for about 6 or 7 people who were the first people to use AASHTOWare for materials, and as well as development of the agency views, which includes things like gathering requirements, creating what we call a submittal, which is really a requirements documentation for the agency view. It involves development, it involves testing through our quality assurance team, and then user acceptance testing, all before we get to the point where we're ready to move things into production. With reports, we go through the same process. We gather the requirements, we create a submittal that documents the requirements, a developer puts together the report, our QA team tests it, and then the business tests it. So all of those things happen during agency view and report development. As we move before we move to production, training happens, or sometimes it's parallel. And then along the way, we also have a lot of work that includes things like data population and system configuration. And I'm gonna let Suzanne speak to that because she explains it so much better than I do.
The first thing I want to say about this is we're looking at it from the perspective of agency view development and when it started and when those were moved to production. The entire time that you're doing those agency views and we're working with those labs, we're gathering the information that you need to put into the system. That's the data. And then which I think of as kind of the threads. So you're putting in all of this data. You have to determine how you're going to name your materials, what you're going to give for a material kind of description, what parts are going to show in the system, how will people look at that and know what they're seeing, and will everyone understand what we're putting out there for them to look at in the system. You have to look at the sources for all of those materials. Here it was the cementitious materials, and you have to look at brands, if they have brands. In terms of the chem lab, we have a lot of brands that we put in there. Source material identifiers, and then you look at all of the things that tie those materials or those threads together. So it's kind of like weaving a cloth. You have to tie all of these things together. So you have the specifications for those materials. You have to know which labs, what are the names of the labs that test those materials? What are the qualifications for being able to sample and test those materials? How do we assign those tests? What should be available when this material comes in as a sample? What are the tests that should be available to assign it to? If we have product groups, how are those set up? We have to set up all of the persons in the system that can either test those materials, sample those materials, or that will be putting this kind of information into the system in the future. So there's a lot of work and decisions, a lot of really big decisions have to be made throughout that process to get this data ready to be put into the system. So, none of this is quick or short, in duration. There's a lot of really hard work that happens there. So does that kind of get us to the point? I don't know if that answers too many questions or not enough, but just basic system setup. Karen, do you want me to talk about the other work?
Yeah, go right ahead. You can certainly do that.
The other work that happens during that period is that every year they have to look at our TMRs, that's the ticketed modification requests, and we have votes and the ability to vote on the ones that we think are, the most important to us and the ones that we want to support and have move forward. And that requires, at least 2 weeks of actually going into the system, looking at what those are, how will they affect us, which ones do we want, which ones do we maybe not care about so much, and determining how we want to place our votes to hopefully get the things we want enhanced or changed in the system to be moved forward. Oops, we lost our little, there we go. Okay, let's see. And also during this period, we were working on the technical certification interface, which is a Salesforce application that we created. And we created an interface so that we are able to, in an overnight data pass certifications into AASHTOWare for the individuals that have a tech cert identifier entered into their person information. So basically it's the information that allows them to either test or sample different materials. So that was done in there. And, you know, we also had some testing of any of the application changes, so any upgrades. So all of that was done in that period.
Perfect. Thank you, Suzanne. So that was the first phase of the project. That took us about 20 months, so about 1 year and 8 months to implement that. Now we move on to phase 2 of the project, which we just moved into production in April. This, in this segment of the project, we completed agency views for the remaining labs, the remaining chem analytical and cement labs, as well as rock salt moisture for G6. We implemented a total of 15 agency views and a little over 14 reports, and I say plus just because there is still a report that we are possibly working on, and that would be for the water for concrete. So those reports, those agency views, we also, as part of this segment, created what we call a universal chem report, which was a report that people could pull up that had sub-reports. So rather than creating individual reports, say for chloride and concrete and miscellaneous chem, there was one universal report with a universal header that was standard, and it was put together in a little bit different way, so people went to that report and could choose which sub-report they wanted to pull up. Again, all of that work around identifying materials and data and all of that stuff that happened in the first phase had to happen in the second phase. And one thing I would point out with this work, as well as really all of the work, and I think maybe Todd alluded to this earlier, but as this project is being implemented, decisions are getting made along the way. Decisions made when other parts of the system were implemented, decisions made when the first phase of the materials implementation was done. And as we're making decisions about these things in subsequent phases, we need to make decisions that jive with the way that we've implemented things in the past. So as we're putting this all together, we have to make sure that the pieces of the puzzle fit. So we can't make a decision about data in phase 2 of this materials lab implementation that doesn't work with what we implemented in the first phase, if that makes any sense. Also along the way, more things happened in the maintenance and other work columns. So for instance, during the implementation of these labs, we had an upgrade to 4.2. In that first implementation, we weren't using the system yet, we being materials. So there wasn't a lot of testing to do as things were, as we moved to say 4.1 or 3 or that kind of thing. But in this phase, we actually had to participate, we being the lab folks, and actually do some regression testing and participate in that upgrade to 4.2. We also had a retirement of the project manager, of Jim Cusick, who was a business person who worked on this. We retired the original LIMS Lab Vantage system. That happened after we went to production in April. So more things happen along the way that we need to participate in. This particular segment took 9 months to implement. We implemented 15 agency views and, as I said, just a little over 14 reports. Suzanne, do you want to add anything as far as this goes?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right, cool. I'm going to move on, and I've lost my mouse. So currently what we're working on is what we're calling phase 3. And this one, we began actual work on this in April once we went to production with the previous implementation. This phase includes it includes the bituminous as well as the aggregate labs, and this includes 37 agency views. This is huge, I would say, 37 agency views, and these agency views aren't just standalone. We have summary agency views. We have agency views that can't be created until we create previous agency views. So there's a lot of interdependencies with Ag and Bit, or with both aggregate and bituminous. Both in both those areas, we have a lot of interdependencies, which complicates things. We have 7 reports, which sounds like, you know, just 7, but actually these reports are, a lot of these reports are summary reports. So we have an aggregate summary report, we have a bituminous summary report that will take information from numerous agency views and pull them into reports. In both columns, those agency views or reports that have asterisks, the double asterisks next to them, are either agency views or reports that we can consider extremely complex, that will take a lot of extra work to not only define requirements, but ensure that we are pulling the correct information. Suzanne, do you want to talk a little bit about the other decisions and things that have to be made for this particular phase?
The main thing here is to note that the first 2 phases were what we were considering easier agency views and easier.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have as much complexity, didn't have as many materials, sources, and that stuff. So we started out with what would be, you know, easier for us to implement as our starting out point. And now we're moving into 2 labs that are, or 2 areas that are much more complex. We have to look at all of the sources, and, you know, there are a ton of sources, and how we're going to describe, you know, we have to name each of those sources. All of that needs to be in there, and we have to identify all of the materials that come from each of those sources. And you have to tie all of that together just to, you know, get that underlying piece of the system in place. You have to look at all of the specifications for those materials and all of the qualifications that are required for the individuals to test those materials and to sample those materials. And we have different kinds of qualifications. So you have our technical certifications, we have lab qualifications. So, you know, all of those things have to have names. They have to be tied to the correct materials and the correct tests. It all is getting much more complex as we go along. And we have, you know, the billing of the different tests, and it compounds itself as we move forward. So it's really important to note that this next phase, there was probably no way it was going to be done in anywhere close to 6 months. And, you know, if you just look at the amount of materials, the amount of tests, and the complexity of the area, you know, and go back and look at what we were capable of doing in the previous session in that timeline, there's no way it could have been done in 6 months.
Thanks, Suzanne. So our estimate for this particular phase of the project is 22 months, and we're basing this very simply on, we're actually not looking at how long it took us to implement phase 1, because we were learning back in phase 1 how to do things. But by phase 2, when we implemented the remainder of the AVs and the reports for the cement and chemical analytical labs, we had a good deal of experience, I think, and our developers and our testers and business folks knew more what they were doing. So we're basing the 22 months really on how long it took us to implement phase 2, which was 9 months, and really just doing a pretty straightforward formula about how long it takes to develop each agency view. So this may actually be a bit optimistic, but this is what we are estimating at this time. This particular phase is going to include a lot more training too than the last phase. This will include training about 50 people. It'll be some multi-day or week-long training sessions for all the district lab, for CO, Ag, and BIT, and for the specialty office. So quite a bit of training will be needed to implement this phase of the project. We have, now that we are using more of the system and we are more involved, we are also more impacted by other things that are going on in the realm of maintenance. For instance, I think Charlie mentioned that right now people will be testing the F5 upgrade, which is an upgrade that's needed to ensure that our system is secure for people who are logging in externally. So that testing will be going on, and materials folks will need to be involved in that. Patch 4.2.6 is a patch that we materials have been desperately waiting for, because it's a patch that includes a fix that will allow us to go back and fix some agency views we implemented in the past to enhance them and make those better. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens with these things is sometimes when we're testing, we discover issues. So for instance, with 4.2.6, we installed that in development, and it literally broke all of our reports. So now we are stalled with report development until we can get a fix for the patch, which will take some time. We've got Infotech obviously working on that, but that will take some time and cause some delays. Also during this phase, we'll have that upgrade that Charlie mentioned to 4.3 and 4.4. So materials folks will need to be heavily involved in testing, regression testing that, to make sure that everything works well with those upgrades. And then, like every year, we'll have that November TMR review and voting. So those are the kinds of things that impact us as we're working to implement these things. I'm going to move on. It looks like I've got about 5 minutes left to things that are left to do after we implement the materials portion for all of the labs. So there's future project work too that at this point we're not including in that 22-month timeline that we talked about, but there will be some additional labs: concrete and cylinders, chem binder, soils lab, the concrete and metals lab. Those labs will need to be implemented. The mobile tester will need to be implemented. We'll need to incorporate the construction field labs and incorporate source labs, implement the independent assurance process, the daily source report. This will include some pilot projects as we move to implementing that, mixed designs, and then ultimately building an approved product list. So a lot of work still involved in implementing this materials portion of AASHTOWare. A lot of good work already done, but a lot of work also in our future to get this implemented. Suzanne, do you have anything you want to add before we close?
No, I think if anybody has any quick questions, if we have time left, otherwise.
Yep, I think we have a few minutes.
Covers it.
Mm-hmm. Gina, do we have any questions?
Yes, I put myself off mute. Yes, we have one question that came in, and the question that came in, and Todd replied to it. The question is, will the current schedule slide, that was when you're early into it, be sent out to the district so we can share with our staff and discuss it with them? That was submitted from Charlie K. And Todd replied, Charlie, we'd be happy to supply any and all information that has been presented. Do you have anything else on that?
You know what I would add? Yeah, what I would add on that, Gina, is obviously we're always willing to share that information. One of the things that we are looking at with this current phase that we're working on. So we've got both aggregate and bituminous that we're looking at implementing. One thing that we may consider doing is breaking this up and implementing aggregate and bituminous in separate phases so that we have the ability to move something to production next fall. One of the stresses we have with AASHTOWare is that we need to move things into production outside of the construction season. So we need to get whatever we're going to move into production with this current phase needs to go in next fall, winter, before the following construction season starts. So we may look at breaking this up into ag and bit so that we're able to actually complete some stuff and move it into production. Another thing we've talked about is just looking at the project as a whole in production release, like year-long phases. What can we move to production each year? Breaking it up that way. We've also looked at things like as we complete an agency view or a group of agency views and the corresponding reports, we can move those things to production also. So, so despite the fact that it may take a while to implement that entire phase, that doesn't preclude us from moving things to production that would be useful if people want to begin to using those.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you, Suzanne. That was really good. That was great information. Can't get over the wealth of information that's already been included in the refresher. Okay, I don't see any other questions out here. With that, we do have Ron would like a minute, if he may. Ron?
I just wanted to take a quick minute to thank everyone that presented this morning. There's a lot of great information there. I know for a majority of you out there that are listening today that was overkill on the information that you needed to hear, but it was very important for the core group. We need to understand where we are and where we've been before we can move forward. So again, I apologize if it was a little bit too much information for you, but it was very crucial for the internal group. And the second thing that I wanted to talk about here is that what you just saw from Karen is a huge change from what was expected. The project was basically supposed to be implemented by the end of 21, and obviously if we're still looking at this phase going into 2022, we're going to have to take some hard looks at the project and what we do moving forward. And Karen mentioned a couple of those. Maybe we'll start breaking it up into smaller sections and getting those out into production sooner. So there's more to come from that. I know that some of you out there wish that we'd have a definite, so you know when your involvement will be, but I think to project out any farther than what we've done would just be irresponsible. I don't think we have that kind of data at this point to make a real quick judgment on that. So there's more to follow on that schedule, just that you know that the end date of 21 is probably not going to happen. So that's really what I wanted to say at this point, and I guess we can move on to the next presentation.